The black sedan looked completely out of place on Route 47, steam rising from under its hood like morning mist over the Pennsylvania farmland. Margaret Whitmore pulled into the gravel lot beside the weathered farm stand, her perfectly manicured, fingers gripping the steering wheel as she stared at the rustic wooden structure ahead. She'd been driving back roads to avoid traffic after the corporate retreat in Lancaster, but now her German-engineered luxury car had betrayed her in the middle of nowhere. The irony wasn't lost on her. Surrounded by millions in quarterly revenue projections, yet helpless before a simple mechanical failure. The farm stand stood against the autumn landscape like something from another century. Hand-painted signs advertised fresh corn and tomatoes picked this morning in cheerful blue lettering. Wooden crates overflowed with late-season produce, and glass milk bottles caught the afternoon sunlight like small beacons. Car trouble? Margaret turned to find a man emerging from behind the produce displays, dusting soil from his work-worn hands. He was tall and broad-shouldered, probably mid-30s, with sandy hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it. His denim overalls were faded but clean, and his grey t-shirt revealed the kind of tan that came from honest outdoor work. The engine overheated, I think. Margaret stepped out of the car, immediately aware of how her tailored grey suit and pearls contrasted with the rural setting. "I'm not exactly mechanical." The man wiped his hands on a cloth and approached her vehicle. "Daniel Reed," he said, popping the hood. "Let me take a look." Margaret Whitmore. She watched as he examined the engine with practiced efficiency. Steam hissed and dissipated in the cool air. "Radiator hose came loose," Daniel said, pointing to a disconnected tube. "Simple fix, but you'll need to let it cool down first. Maybe 20 minutes. Margaret glanced at her watch. A habit that served no purpose out here, where time seemed to move at the pace of growing seasons rather than quarterly reports. "I suppose I'll wait then. Can I offer you something while you do?" "Apple ciders?" Fresh pressed this morning, she found herself accepting following Daniel to a small table beside the farm stand. He poured golden cider from a large glass jug into a mason jar, and Margaret was surprised by how crisp and complex it tasted, nothing like the processed versions she occasionally bought at upscale grocery stores. "This is exceptional," she said, meaning it. Daniel's face lit up with quiet pride. "Grandmother's recipe. She taught me that the secret isn't just the apples, it's knowing exactly when each variety reaches peak flavor." Margaret found herself studying the farm stand with new attention. What she'd initially dismissed as a quaint roadside attraction revealed itself to be something more sophisticated. The produce was arranged with an artist's eye for color and texture. Price tags were written in the same careful script as the larger signs. Everything was spotlessly clean, despite the dusty rural setting. "How long have you been running this operation?" she asked. 3 generations. My grandfather started it in 1952. My father expanded it, and I've been trying to keep it going since he passed 2 years ago." Daniel's voice carried a weight that suggested the trying wasn't going particularly well. Margaret's business instincts, honed by 15 years climbing corporate ladders, began to activate. "Trying?" Daniel hesitated, then seemed to decide she was safe to confide in. "Bank called my loan. I've got until Christmas to pay up or lose everything." He gestured toward the fields beyond the stand. 47 acres that's been in my family since before my grandmother was born." "How much do you need?" The question surprised them both. Margaret hadn't intended to ask, and Daniel clearly hadn't expected such directness from a stranger in expensive clothes. 50,000 would cover it, he said carefully, but banks don't lend to small operations anymore. They want big agribusiness contracts, not family farms selling tomatoes by the basket. Margaret walked among the produce displays while Daniel talked, picking up a tomato that felt firm and heavy in her palm. She inhaled its scent, earthy and sweet, nothing like the pale specimens shipped from industrial farms to her usual grocery stores. "What makes these different?" she asked. "Heirloom. Varieties. Cherokee purples, brandywines, green zebras. My grandmother saved seeds every year, selecting for flavor instead of shelf life. These tomatoes have stories going back generations." Margaret bit into a cherry tomato and tasted sunshine, rain, and something indefinable that might have been love. In her world of profit margins and market projections, she'd forgotten food could be more than fuel. "Your distribution network?" "Mostly local. Farmers market in town on Saturdays, some restaurants in Lancaster County. Nothing fancy." "Marketing budget?" Daniel laughed. "Word of mouth and a hand-painted sign on Route 47. Margaret pulled out her checkbook, writing quickly before she could reconsider. She tore off the check and handed it to Daniel, whose expression shifted from confusion to disbelief as he read the amount. $50,000, he said slowly. "You're serious?" "Consider it an investment in local agricultural ventures." Daniel stared at the check, then at Margaret. "Lady, I don't even know you. People don't just hand out money like this." "Smart people invest where they see potential," Margaret said. But even as she spoke, she wondered what had possessed her. She'd just written a personal check for more money than some people made in a year, to a stranger at a roadside farm stand. "What do you want in return?" The question hung between them like morning fog. Margaret realized she didn't have a clear answer. "Let's see what you can do with a real chance," she said finally. 20 minutes later, Daniel had her car running smoothly again. Margaret drove away with a basket of produce in her back seat and Daniel's business card in her purse, watching in her rearview mirror as he stood among his tomatoes and corn, still holding her check like it might disappear. The following week, Margaret found herself thinking about heirloom tomatoes during board meetings and wondering about harvest schedules while reviewing quarterly projections. By Friday, she'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible 2 weeks earlier. She returned to Millbrook Valley wearing jeans and a cotton blouse, driving her practical Honda instead of the luxury sedan. Daniel was arranging pumpkins when she pulled into the gravel lot, and his smile of recognition sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "Come to check on your investment?" he asked. Something like that. Margaret spent the morning learning about companion planting and soil, pH levels, discovering muscles she'd forgotten she had as she helped load customers' cars with produce. Daniel was a natural teacher, explaining complex agricultural concepts with simple metaphors that made sense to her business-trained mind. "Customer retention in farming is all about trust," he said, wrapping newspaper around a bouquet of sunflowers. "For an elderly woman. Mrs. Henderson has been buying corn here for 30 years because she knows it'll be the sweetest she can find. You can't fake that kind of quality." Margaret found herself taking notes, seeing parallels between Daniel's approach and the customer loyalty strategies she'd implemented at Heritage Foods Corporation. But where her corporate methods relied on data analysis and market research, Daniel's knowledge came from generations of hands-on experience and intuitive understanding of what people wanted. By lunch, word had spread through Millbrook Valley's efficient gossip network that the city woman was back. Margaret noticed sidelong glances from customers and heard whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. "They're talking about us," she said to Daniel as they shared sandwiches. At the small table. "Small town," Daniel replied with a shrug. "People talk." But Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he watched customers' faces for signs of disapproval. By afternoon, when longtime patron Mrs. Henderson asked pointed questions about Daniel's new partner, the strain was showing. "People are wondering what you really want," Daniel said after Mrs. Henderson left with a smaller purchase than usual. "What do you think I want?" "That's what worries me. I still don't understand why you'd invest in a stranger's failing farm stand. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. Board meeting moved to Tuesday. Need Q3 projections for organic division. The reminder of her other life, conference rooms and profit margins and quarterly projections, felt jarring after. A morning spent among pumpkins and sunflowers. She looked at Daniel, who was stacking empty crates with the methodical precision of someone whose life ran on seasonal rhythms rather than corporate schedules. I need to make some calls, she said. Walking toward her car, her assistant answered on the first ring. Margaret, thank goodness, the organic division numbers look terrible. We need to discuss expansion strategies, or the board will want to cut the whole program. Margaret found herself describing Daniel's operation, the quality of his produce, the customer loyalty he'd built, the potential for scaling his methods across multiple locations. As she talked, she began to see possibilities that excited her more than any corporate project had in years. So you're suggesting we partner with this farmer? Her assistant asked. I'm suggesting we learn from him. That afternoon, Margaret presented Daniel with a proposal that had crystallized during her phone calls. Heritage Foods would provide capital and distribution networks, while Daniel maintained complete control over farming methods and quality standards. They could expand gradually, first to farmers' markets in surrounding counties, then to select restaurants and specialty stores. You're talking about changing everything, Daniel said. I'm talking about sharing what you do best with more people. But as Margaret outlined her vision, refrigerated trucks and processing facilities, supply chain management and market expansion, she saw something shift in Daniel's expression. The enthusiasm faded, replaced by the wariness of someone who'd heard promises before. What happens to this? Daniel gestured toward his farm stand, the hand-painted signs and wooden crates that represented 3 generations of careful tending. It becomes the flagship location, the heart of the operation. And if I say no to the expansion? Margaret hesitated. Then you say no. But they both knew it wasn't that simple. $50,000 created obligations, expectations, pressure to perform that hadn't existed when Daniel was simply trying to keep his family's farm alive. That evening, Margaret drove back to her hotel room in Lancaster, leaving Daniel alone among his pumpkins and corn. She'd thought she was offering him opportunity, but now she wondered if she'd actually given him a different kind of trap. The next morning brought complications Margaret hadn't anticipated. Her phone rang at dawn, with her assistant's panicked voice. The board knows about the $50,000. They're asking questions about unauthorized personal investments in potential suppliers. It wasn't unauthorized. I used my own money for a Heritage Foods venture. They want documentation, contracts, projected returns. Margaret, they think you're having some kind of breakdown. Margaret sat on the edge of her hotel bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes, and realized how her actions must look to corporate executives who measured success in quarterly growth percentages and market share data. A CEO who disappeared to rural Pennsylvania and wrote large checks to farmers she'd just met was exhibiting behavior that boards of directors found deeply troubling. Schedule a meeting for Monday, she said. I'll explain everything. But as she drove back to Millbrook Valley, Margaret wasn't sure she could explain her actions to herself, much less to a room full of skeptical board members. What had started as an impulsive gesture of support had evolved into something she couldn't clearly define, part business venture, part personal mission, part escape from a life that suddenly felt hollow, despite its outward success. Daniel was loading his truck when she arrived, preparing for Saturday's farmers' market in town. He looked up as she parked, and she saw immediately that something had changed overnight. We need to talk, he said. They walked beyond the farm stand to a wooden bench overlooking the fields where Daniel's grandfather had first planted tomatoes. 70 years earlier, the morning light cast long shadows across rows of spent plants, and Margaret could smell the earthy scent of approaching winter. I did some research last night, Daniel said, pulling out a crumpled magazine page. Heritage Foods Corporation. Annual revenue of $47 million. Recent acquisitions include family farms in Ohio, Virginia, and Maryland. Margaret's stomach dropped as she recognized the article, a business journal piece about consolidation in organic agriculture. Her company's logo was prominently featured alongside statistics about small farm absorption rates. You're not just some rich lady who liked my tomatoes, Daniel continued. You're a corporate executive who specializes in buying out operations. Like mine. It's not like that. Then what is it like? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like Heritage Foods found a new way to acquire suppliers. Instead of making offers through lawyers, you show up personally with a check and a smile. Margaret felt the accusation like a physical blow. Daniel, I came here because my car broke down. Everything that happened after that was genuine. Was it? Because your company has been quietly buying up small farms across 3 states. My neighbor Joe Morrison, he sold to Heritage Foods last spring. Now he's a contract grower supplying your processing facilities. I didn't know about Joe Morrison, but you knew about the acquisition strategy. You knew what Heritage Foods does to family operations. Margaret stood and walked to the edge of the field, staring at rows of withered tomato plants that would soon be plowed under for winter. She'd built her career on strategic thinking, on seeing opportunities others missed and acting decisively to capitalize on them. But now her professional instincts had led her into personal territory she wasn't equipped to navigate. You're right, she said finally. Heritage Foods has been acquiring small suppliers, but what I did here wasn't part of that strategy. How can you be sure? The question forced Margaret to confront motivations she'd been avoiding since writing that first check. Because Heritage Foods is failing, she said quietly. We've spent 3 years buying up suppliers, and our quality has gotten worse every quarter. Customers are abandoning us for competitors who actually deliver on the promises we make about organic, sustainable agriculture. Daniel joined her at the field's edge. So, you came here looking for better suppliers. I came here with a broken radiator hose. But when I tasted your tomatoes and saw how you run this operation, I realized you represent everything Heritage Foods claims to be, but isn't. And the $50,000 was my personal money, not corporate funds. I invested in you because I believe in what you're doing. Believing and profiting aren't mutually exclusive. Margaret turned to face him. What if they were? What if I told you I don't want anything in return except the chance to learn how to do this right? I'd say you're either lying or crazy. Maybe both. They stood in silence, watching a red-tailed hawk circle over the fields. Margaret felt the weight of expectations she'd created without fully understanding their implications. She'd thought she was offering Daniel opportunity, but she'd actually presented him with a choice between independence and security that no one should have to make. The board wants to meet with you, she said. They want contracts, projections, documentation of our partnership. What kind of partnership did you tell them we had? The kind that would save both our futures. Daniel kicked at a clod of earth with his boot. And if I say no, then you say no, but I'll need to return the $50,000, which I've already spent on equipment and debt payments. The impossible position Margaret had created crystallized between them like frost on morning grass. Her good intentions had trapped Daniel in exactly the kind of corporate relationship she'd meant to help him avoid. I'm sorry, she said. I thought I was helping. Maybe you were. But helping and controlling tend to look pretty similar from the receiving end. Margaret drove back to Lancaster that afternoon with the taste of failure sharp in her mouth. She'd spent her career solving complex problems through strategic thinking and decisive action. But now those same skills had created a problem she couldn't solve without someone getting hurt. Her hotel room felt sterile after days spent among pumpkins and corn. Margaret sat at the small desk and opened her laptop, staring at quarterly reports that suddenly seemed abstract and meaningless. Numbers on screens couldn't capture the scent of heirloom tomatoes or the satisfaction of work that connected you directly to the people it served. She was still sitting there when her phone rang at midnight. Daniel's voice was quiet, but clear. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Heritage Foods failing. Daniel, it's late. Why is it failing?" Margaret closed her laptop and focused on his question. "Poor supplier relationships, inconsistent quality. We grew too fast and lost sight of what made organic agriculture valuable in the first place. So you need better farmers. We need to remember that food is more than a commodity." "What if," Daniel said slowly, "instead of trying to fit me into Heritage Foods, we figured out how to make Heritage Foods work like this farm?" The idea hung between them across the phone connection. Margaret had been thinking in terms of expansion and acquisition, but Daniel was suggesting something more fundamental, transformation rather than growth. "That would mean changing everything about how we operate," Margaret said. "Would that be bad?" Margaret looked out her hotel window at Lancaster County farmland stretching toward distant hills. "It would be revolutionary." They talked until dawn, sketching possibilities that grew more exciting with each exchange. Instead of buying out family farms, Heritage Foods could partner with them as equals. Instead of imposing corporate standards, they could learn from farmers who understood that quality came from care rather than efficiency. Margaret found herself energized in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The corporate projects that had once thrilled her seemed pale compared to the prospect of rebuilding her company around principles she'd witnessed firsthand at Daniel's farm stand. "We'd be starting over," she told him. "Sometimes that's the only way to get where you need to go." By Sunday morning, Margaret had sketched out a preliminary plan that inverted everything Heritage Foods had been doing. Instead of acquiring suppliers, they would support independent farmers. Instead of standardizing processes, they would celebrate diversity. Instead of maximizing efficiency, they would prioritize authenticity. She was reviewing her notes when her assistant called with news that changed everything. "The board met yesterday without you," the voice said. "Emergency session. They're demanding immediate documentation of your Pennsylvania activities, or they'll consider it breach of fiduciary duty." "What does that mean?" "It means they think you're using company resources for personal projects. They want the $50,000 back immediately and all connections with this farmer terminated." Margaret stared out at the farmland that had come to represent everything she'd lost touch with in her corporate climb. "And if I refuse?" "They'll ask for your resignation." The ultimatum shouldn't have surprised her. Boards of directors weren't known for tolerating executives who disappeared to rural Pennsylvania and wrote large checks to farmers they'd just met. But Margaret had spent the weekend remembering why she'd entered the food industry in the first place, not for quarterly projections, but for the simple satisfaction of connecting people with nourishment that actually nourished. "Schedule the meeting for tomorrow morning," she said. That afternoon, Margaret drove to Millbrook Valley one final time. She found Daniel at his farm stand, helping a family select pumpkins for carving. He looked up as she approached, and she saw in his expression that he already knew why she'd come. "They want their money back," she said after the family left, "and if you don't give it to them, I lose my job." Daniel leaned against his truck, studying her face. "What are you going to do?" Margaret had been asking herself the same question. During the drive from Lancaster, she could return to corporate life, write off the $50,000 as an expensive lesson, and pretend the last 2 weeks had never happened. Or she could step off the safe path she'd been following for 15 years and see where authenticity might lead. "I'm going to resign," she said. "Margaret, they're right about one thing. I've been using Heritage Foods resources for personal projects. I've been trying to remember what food is supposed to be." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "What will you do?" "I have some savings. Maybe I'll start something new. Something that works more like this." She gestured toward his farm stand. "You'd give up everything you've built? I'd trade what I've built for what you have. The question is whether you'd want a partner who comes with that much baggage." Daniel walked among his produce displays, straightening signs and adjusting arrangements with the careful attention Margaret had come to recognize as his way of thinking through complex problems. Finally, he turned back to her. "What kind of partner are we talking about?" "The kind who learns instead of teaching, who follows your lead on everything related to farming and shares what she knows about business only when asked." "And the 50,000? "Keep it. Consider it seed money for whatever we build together." "We." Margaret felt something shift. In her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "If you'll have me," Daniel smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. "I think I'd like that." The board meeting Monday morning lasted exactly 17 minutes. Margaret entered the conference room carrying a single sheet of paper, her resignation letter, and placed it on the polished table without sitting down. "You're making a mistake," the chairman said. "Heritage Foods needs your expertise." "Heritage Foods needs to remember why it exists," Margaret replied, "and I need to remember who I am when I'm not in this room." She was in her car driving toward Pennsylvania before the shock wore off. 15 years of corporate climbing had ended with a 2-sentence letter and a walk across a parking lot. Margaret felt lighter with each mile that passed, as if she were shedding weight she hadn't known she was carrying. Daniel was waiting when she arrived at the farm stand, as if he'd known she would come straight there. He helped her carry boxes from her car, personal items from her office that represented a life she was leaving behind. "Any regrets?" he asked. Margaret looked around at the wooden crates and hand-painted signs, the honest work and simple beauty of what Daniel had built, only that it took me this long. They spent the afternoon developing plans for what they were already calling Reed and Whitmore Family Farm. Daniel would continue managing the agricultural side while Margaret handled distribution and marketing. They would start small, adding 2 more farmers' markets, developing relationships with restaurants that valued quality over convenience. "No refrigerated trucks?" Daniel asked with a smile. "Not unless you want them." "No processing facilities?" "Only what we need to serve our customers well." As the sun set over the Pennsylvania farmland, Margaret helped Daniel arrange tomorrow's produce displays. Her hands were dirty for the first time in years, and her business suit had been replaced by jeans and a flannel shirt borrowed from Daniel's closet. "Think this will work?" she asked, adjusting a sign advertising late-season tomatoes. "Ask me in a year." Margaret stepped back to survey their work. The farm stand looked exactly as it had 2 weeks ago, but everything had changed. Tomorrow would bring the first customers to see their new partnership, the first test of whether a former CEO and a third-generation farmer could build something worth both their investments. The gravel crunched under approaching tires as their first customer of the evening arrived, Mrs. Henderson, carrying an empty basket and wearing the cautious expression of someone who'd heard rumors but wanted to see for herself what was happening at the Reed farm. "Evening, Daniel," she said, then nodded politely toward Margaret. Mrs. Henderson, I'd like you to meet my partner, Margaret Whitmore. Margaret, this is Mrs. Henderson. She grows the best roses in Millbrook Valley." Margaret wiped her hands on her jeans before extending one toward the older woman. "Daniel tells me you've been a customer here for 30 years. "Since before this young man was born," Mrs. Henderson replied, accepting the handshake. "His grandmother was a dear friend of mine." She must have been proud of what Daniel's built here. She would have been. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly, though she might be surprised to see a city woman helping with the harvest. "I'm learning," Margaret said. "Daniel's a good teacher." Mrs. Henderson selected tomatoes and corn with the practiced eye of someone who knew quality when she saw it. At the small table where customers paid, she paused to examine the new sign Daniel had painted that morning. "Reed and Whitmore Family Farm. Heritage you can taste." "Partnership, then?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Daniel replied. Mrs. Henderson counted out exact change and placed it in the cigar box that served as their cash register. "Well," she said, "I suppose we'll see how it goes." As her car pulled away, Margaret felt the weight of community judgment that came with small-town life. Every customer would be evaluating not just their produce, but their partnership, wondering whether an outsider could truly understand what the Reed farm meant to Millbrook Valley. "She seemed to approve," Margaret said hopefully. "Mrs. Henderson doesn't approve of anything until she's had time to think about it. Check back in 6 months." They worked together as darkness fell, storing unsold produce and securing the farm stand for the night. Margaret's movements were still awkward compared to Daniel's practiced efficiency, but she was learning to read the rhythms of work that followed natural cycles rather than corporate schedules. "Tired?" Daniel asked as they finished. Margaret considered the question honestly. Her body was tired in a way that felt satisfying rather than depleting. Her mind, freed from the constant pressure of quarterly projections and board expectations, felt clearer than it had in years. "Good tired," she said. They stood together in the gathering dusk, looking out over fields that would soon be prepared for winter. In a few months, they would begin planning next year's crops, deciding which heirloom varieties to expand and which new markets to explore. The work would be challenging, but it would be theirs. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her former assistant. "Board-approved interim CEO. Organic division being dissolved. Heard about your new venture. Wishing you luck." She showed the message to Daniel, who read it with the thoughtful expression she'd come to recognize as his way of processing significant information. "Any second thoughts about giving up corporate life?" he asked. Margaret looked around at the farm stand that would be her office, the fields that would determine her success, the simple wooden structures that represented everything she'd been missing in climate-controlled conference rooms. "Only that I waited so long to find this," she said. Daniel's hand brushed hers as they both reached for the same crate of unsold apples. The contact lasted only a moment, but it carried the weight of shared purpose and mutual respect that had grown between them over the past 2 weeks. No words were needed. They had found something worth investing everything in, not just a business partnership, but a way of life that honored both the land and the people it fed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they stood together in the satisfaction of work well done and dreams worth pursuing. The first stars appeared over Millbrook Valley as Margaret helped Daniel carry the last of the produce inside. In the distance, she could hear the gentle lowing of cattle settling in for the night and the whisper of wind through corn stalks that would soon be harvested. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Work that connected her to something larger than profit margins, a partnership built on shared values rather than strategic advantage, a life that measured success in satisfied customers and sustainable practices rather than quarterly growth. As they walked toward Daniel's farmhouse, where she would stay until finding a place of her own in Millbrook Valley, Margaret felt the deep contentment of someone who had finally found her way home. The road ahead would be uncertain, but it would be authentic. And after 15 years of corporate climbing, authenticity felt like the greatest investment she could make. Behind them, the farm stand stood ready for tomorrow's customers, its hand-painted signs barely visible in the starlight. By dawn, Daniel would be checking the produce displays, and Margaret would be learning to make coffee on his old kitchen stove. Together, they would begin another day of building something that honored the past while embracing the future, a partnership as carefully tended as the heirloom tomatoes that had brought them together. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments so you don't miss the next episodes. See you in the next story.